take one with Daryl Nash. Clap a little louder for me. There you go. So can you just tell me who you are?
Yes, I'm Daryl Nash.
Mm-hmm. What do you do for a living?
I'm retired currently.
Mm-hmm.
I've worked in sales and management and marketing all my career until a couple of years ago I went to work as a caregiver. In my retired years, I figured I had been very blessed and wanted to do something for other people.
And what was that experience like?
It was one of the most touching things that I've ever done in my career. Everything has been products and services that I've sold, but doing caregiving for people who had handicaps of one sort or another was really eye-opening. I'd had some experience with other family members that had had some cognitive problems as they grew older. So I had some experience with that. But when you see someone 3 times a week or more for 2 or 3 hours each day, sometimes it can, they're almost like a part of your family. So as they degrade, you really feel it. You, like I say, they become like a family member.
Is it hard to watch them go through that process?
It's hard, but it's understandable. And when you go into, as a caregiver, when you go into the home, you're pretty well assured that 6 months or a year or 2 years later, they're not going to be in as good a shape as you would anticipate. I did have a few people who were in hospice, and in hospice, I ended up going to the funeral home after they had passed away and revisited with the family and got some beautiful thank you notes.
Do you ever fear you'll end up like that?
Yes. My father had a good friend who was a medical doctor, and they used to go bird hunting together. And they both decided they wanted to have a heart attack when they got to the end of their journey. And coincidentally, they both did. My father had a heart attack while down in Fort Myers, Florida. But yes, that's a concern. As I see these people, I think, where am I going to be in 10 years or 15 or 20 years?
How old were you when your father died?
I was 45.
And how did you hear about his death?
I got a telephone call from one of my brothers. I have 2 brothers and a sister, and my oldest brother called and told me. My father retired at 62 and would go down to Florida about the 1st of November after they voted, my parents, after they voted, and would go to Florida and the south part of Florida and do a lot of fishing and enjoy the outdoors, and then come back every year about April. So he had about 10 years of that and enjoyed that part of his life immensely.
What did your father do for work?
My father was a newspaper man at different levels. He started out at about 16, and back in those days, newspapers were newspaper carriers also sold life insurance.
Why is that?
It was a moneymaker. So my father would go out with the sales or the newspaper boys, and at about 16 he was kind of a mentor for them, and he would sell these insurance policies. So he did this, and for a couple of weeks he went back and he told them, I've really done a good job. And they said, you have done a good job. And the boss came out and found out how much he made, and the boss cut commissions. So the boss came out again 2 weeks later, found out how much he made. He said, "You're making more money than I am. I got to cut your commissions again." So he quit doing that, and they offered him a position in the delivery department. So he became a truck driver, delivering the papers out to the carriers' routes. My father was one of the real interesting folks in my life. With, I think, an 8th grade education, the teacher told him, I think he'd finished the 8th grade, and she said, he lived down in Kentucky, and the teacher came to him and said, "I've taught you everything I know, and no sense you coming back." So Dad was a avid reader, and there was a financial reporter by the name of Sylvia Porter, and he read her column and books very carefully, and ended up amassing a pretty good sum of money, and was a man that I was always very proud of. He was one of those parents that always loved his kids unequivocally. There were times where I think he had a choice to be with a friend or with one of his children to go fishing or hunting or go to a park, and he chose his children many times.
Did your dad like his work?
I think he tolerated it. I don't think it was mentally challenging at all, but he liked the people he worked with, and it was a newspaper in Louisville, the Courier-Journal, which was considered by journal schools as the 5th best newspaper in the country, and they had an evening paper for many years, and they were rated as the best morning and evening combination in the country. So their journalism was outstanding, and the people who owned the newspaper also had a radio and a TV station that were atop the newspaper. The radio station was the 4th and 5th floors, and the TV station was on the 6th floor. So they had a really an outstanding media group there, and later sold it to USA Today. But the owner was very good to work for. He had one person that I came to know because I worked there while I was going to school to IU, and one person had come back from the war, World War II, and had a lot of shrapnel in him, and he'd been in the hospital for 6 months, and this owner allowed him to continue working there, even though he was a terrible alcoholic, but there was no way he was going to be fired. They worked with him, and it was a pity there wasn't some facility for him to help dry him out. But this was a man named, his first name was Norman, and Norman had the most beautiful handwriting I've ever seen. It was like something out of just a beautiful penmanship. And when Norman would write, sometimes he had the shakes, and his hand would be almost like a palsy. But once he hit the paper, it would be those beautiful lines, and it was just incredible. But the owner of the paper was very good to work for and cared about his people, something to such an extent that I'm sure many times it wasn't profitable to keep some employees in situations like that, but they had been in the war, and he was a great employer.
And did your father fight in the war?
No, my father did not. He was just a little bit ahead of World War II. Mm-hmm. And I was just a little bit ahead of the Vietnam War. When I say ahead of it, they asked me to come in and take a physical, because at that time they were drawing names out in each county, they had a draft board, and they drew names out depending on your birth date. So when they drew your birth date, they called you in. They first called you, and then if you answered the questions the way they wanted, then they called you in for a physical, and then you were drafted. My wife was 3 months pregnant with my oldest daughter, and they told me that she better be pregnant, and I had to get a letter from the doctor, and they said she better be born. So I didn't go to Vietnam, but I would have had no qualms about going if I wasn't married and had a pregnant wife.
How do you feel about staying at home when you saw your peers going to war?
Very mixed emotions. The Vietnam War was really strange. Maybe for one of the few times ever in our history, outside of the Civil War, it divided families. A lot of times there would be one son that was against the Vietnam War and another one that was very much, he would consider patriotic. And in fact, both of them would consider themselves patriotic, but one was eager to go and the other one not so much. And of course, many people went to Canada and did other things to avoid going to Vietnam. I had a friend that went to Vietnam. He had amoebic dysentery and malaria. He was from Evansville and married, and they had to take out about half his stomach. So for the rest of his life, when he eats a meal, he can only eat about a half a cup at a time, and he breaks out in a sweat. He has to keep a handkerchief with him, and he wipes his brow a couple of times during the meal. He came home and said, "Honey, I'm home." And his wife said, "You might as well turn around and leave because I'm going to divorce you and marry someone else." So there's a lot of twist to war that many times we just don't realize.
How do you think your father felt not going during World War II?
I'm not really sure. I know by working at the newspaper, which was the main source of news back in the 1950s, there was radio, but I think he felt like he had a duty to provide news and information to people that newspapers don't play that role today.
What do you think he would, if he could have done anything, what do you think he would have done for a living?
One of his neighbors wanted him to go to school, and he was going to pay for him to be a medical doctor. And Dad had all the smarts to do that, but he was about 10 or 15 years younger than his next sibling. There were 4 of them. He had a brother, then a sister, and then another sister, and there was about a 10 or 15 year gap. And his mother was in Grayson County, Kentucky, and his father had died when he was 2, and she didn't want to see him go to school and go away and leave her behind. So when he came to Louisville from down in Kentucky and got this job through my uncle at the newspaper, she was very worried about it, and obviously didn't want to be alone and didn't have any money-making skills. So she followed him to southern Indiana in the Louisville metropolitan area.
Did you go to school?
Yes, I went to 2 schools. One was a school for advertising and sales, and then I went to Indiana University.
And how'd you pay for that?
There weren't grants that I knew of at that time, So I paid for it out of my pocket. But interesting, a little difference in price of everything back then. I think my first job at the newspaper was on the loading dock, and my dad told me that the person who ran the department was nearing 65, and I could probably have a career there all my life. But somehow lifting these 300 and 500 pound barrels of ink didn't seem like a very challenging career. So I left that department and went to a department called the Information and Service Bureau. People could call the newspaper, a major newspaper back in those days, and they would answer your questions or go look it up in the library. My perhaps most interesting question was a letter that came to me from the LaGrange Reformatory just outside of Louisville in LaGrange, Kentucky. And a prisoner wanted to know how much space it would take for $1,000,000 $1 bills. I didn't follow up on that. I did send him a letter and told him how much. And apparently, by contacting the Federal Deposit Corporation, a good-sized refrigerator could have held the $1,000,000. I think they were in stacks of 15,000. But I left that Information and Service Bureau after I was there, or while I was there, I started guiding tours around the building. And it was on one of these tours with some grade school kids, and we would show them different parts of the newspaper and how the newspaper was made. And the newspaper had a program where there was newspapers in the classroom. So they explained to the students, and the students had newspapers to know the difference between columnist and what the opinion page was and the op-ed page was. And it was really a good journalism class and an English class for the students in high schools. One group that I had taken, we just finished the tour, and one of the boys said, "That man back there said the president's been shot." And I started to say, that is a terrible joke. Because sometimes some of the union members particularly would joke with the kids as they were coming through. And then all of a sudden people start coming down the hall saying, "President Kennedy's been shot." So I dismissed the group and went up to the teletype machine. And after a few minutes in watching the teletype machine, I thought, well, this is silly. I'll go to the radio station. So I went up to the radio station to get the latest news. And of course, there was no television that was sent directly from Dallas back then. And I went on up to the TV station to see what was going on up there. And as they were a CBS station, Walter Cronkite was on. And I could see tears coming down his face. And he took his glasses off a couple times and wiped his eyes. And it was a very poignant thing to be part of. And then Earl Ruby shooting Lee Oswald a day or two later. There was just so much craziness in that 3 or 4 day period. It was just almost overwhelming. You could go to a grocery store and stand in line and look at some of the other people, and you'd see people crying.
So, regardless of your political views, how do you think people would react today to a similar situation?
Of a shooting of a president?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it certainly obviously makes a person a martyr, and a lot of people that maybe were against some of the policies were kind of, I won't use the term, I will use it, I guess, kind of brought aboard. And I think whether it's in such a situation, it makes a lot of people feel that they were maybe better than they would have thought had they gone and finished their term. It's almost like it magnetically pulls a lot of people toward them. And I had friends that weren't very fond of President Kennedy, but after he was shot and they experienced the funeral and his young son and daughter and his wife walking in the procession, they became big fans of John Kennedy. I think an assassination has that tendency to pull people across the line, and maybe it's a type of empathy, but I found a lot of people that liked him a lot more after he was shot than while he was president.
How old were you when he was shot?
Pardon?
How old were you when he was shot?
I had just gotten married about 3 months before. It was 1963, so I think I was 21 years old at the time.
What was your childhood like?
Pardon?
What was your childhood like?
My childhood was a very happy one. I went to, my first 5 years, went to a country school. I had to ride the school bus, and back then there was a hat that had it was a fur hat and had a tail, and it was a Davy Crockett hat that was very popular, and everybody had to have a Davy Crockett hat. And there was a time where, for some reason, the Confederate and Union War was very big, and most of my friends and I took sides, one or the other side, with either the Union or the Confederacy. And that was, I remember that playing out during school. But it was a happy childhood. I lived near some woods, and we used to joke about our pets were turtles and things that we had found in the woods, and we'd bring back to our house. But my father, one of his hobbies was teaching bird dogs how to work on command, and he was quite good at it. He interestingly, one of the books that he read when he started this said the first thing you have to decide is who's smarter, you or the dog. But we always had dogs around the house that were always outdoors, and hunting dogs. And it seems like back in the 50s he would sell them for $300 or $400 that had been well trained. And they were a delight. He could whistle and he'd go this way and the dog would work that way, or he could call him to come back closer. And they were just, it was just beautiful to see him and the dogs working together. But my childhood was very happy. In the 6th grade, the city had taken us in to the city limits. They'd expanded, and I went to a city school that was at the edge of a housing project. And it was a different social economic group completely than these kids that had lived on farms. And I remember a couple of times being asked, what are you going to wear on Sundays if you're wearing such good clothes today? And I really felt badly for some of these kids because many of them had really difficulties in their families. And in this housing project that was owned by the city, there were a lot of them that had experienced a lot of alcoholism and even drugs back in those days of the early 50s. And then I went after going to a junior high school. It was referred to as the old junior high school in New Albany. The basketball gymnasium had one row of seats all the way around it, and it had 4 posts that were about 2 feet in diameter that were right on the floor that helped support the school. And the school, the year after we left that school, they tore it down. And I went to a brand new school as an 8th grader. It had a swimming pool, completely the reverse of what I'd had in the 7th grade. And my parents bought an apartment complex in a nearby city. So I moved to Clarksville High School my freshman and sophomore year. And my father got an offer he couldn't refuse. And after 2 years of living in Clarksville, we returned back to New Albany. But while in Clarksville, I was in a school that had about 200 students in the high school, and was fortunate to become the class president as a freshman and a new person in town. But I had to give a lot of the credit to that. The lady across the street was with the newspaper, and she was referred to because she walked all over a pretty good sized little town. She always walked, she never drove, and she had her camera with her, and she was referred to as One Shot Atwood. If there was a party any place, all you had to do was call her, and she was there, and it was in the paper the next day. So Mrs. One Shot Atwood had my picture in the paper, I think 3 or 4 times that summer when we moved there. So a lot of people knew me before I even attended school. But I had the opportunity to play basketball and learned a lot more about team sports and enjoyed that immensely. And the travel to other small schools and the camaraderie of having these other players. And then when I moved back to New Albany, it was a school of about 2,000 or 2,500. That on graduation day, I think there was around 600 in my graduating class. And there were people in that class that in my 2 years in the school I'd never seen before. The school had one of many things that they were awfully proud of was that they were the oldest high school in the state of Indiana. And it was a good childhood. And after graduating, I met my wife, who was finishing up her junior year there at the school. And after she'd gone to Georgetown College, we ended up marrying.
How old were you when you got married?
I was 21.
Why'd you decide to get married?
Good question. As one thinks back over one's life, she and I had very similar religious background. Hers was maybe a little more strict than mine, but we were both very Bible-based, and we had a lot in common. And I guess I can use that word that seems a little corny sometimes, but I think we really fell in love. And ended up, after a couple of years of marriage, had our first daughter. And then each 4 years, we had another daughter for a total of 3 daughters.
Mm-hmm. How much did finances play a role with you and your wife?
I'm sorry?
How much did finances play a role with you and your wife?
They were interesting and important. When I was working at the Courier-Journal right out of high school and attending Indiana University Southeast, which was in Jeffersonville then, I was bringing home $40 a week. And in the summer, Donna came home from Georgetown College, and she worked as a waitress carrying, it was a, similar to what in Indianapolis we have as an MCL, but they would carry the trays for everybody, and many of those trays had to be carried up steps, which were pretty heavy for a 100-pound woman. But she didn't make an awful lot of money either. But one day I was kind of complaining to a fellow employee at the Courier-Journal that my $40 didn't seem to go very far. And she said, well, my father owns, I had known that she had told me before that her father owned 3 horse farms in Kentucky. So I knew they were pretty well fixed financially. So I was complaining about this $40 a week bring home that was so tough to make ends meet. I think I had a car payment of a brand new car that was $10 a week. Love those prices. And it was a Austin Healey little sports car. And when I told her that this gal that I worked with, I told her that that it's just so hard to make ends meet. She said, sell some of your stocks and bonds. I said, doggone it, I didn't think of that. That's what she would have done, of course. When I was with the Courier-Journal, I went from their Information and Service Bureau, as they called it, answering telephone calls, and one of my jobs was to read the paper from cover to cover every day, know what was in the paper so that I could intelligently answer questions, or if I needed to go to the library where they had clippings of all the articles in the paper and could go through these clippings and find answers to the questions. From there, I was promoted to the classified advertising and sold classified advertising. And there was a tier level from classified to local advertising, retail advertising it was called, and then there was national advertising. And after doing a much better than average job in the classified department, I was promoted past the retail department over to the national advertising. So it was then that I got to work with our out-of-town representatives and fly to different clients around the country. I realized something that I had seen in some other papers was that there were a lot of life insurance companies that were starting to use newspaper advertising on Sundays. And I jumped on that bandwagon because I was responsible for, among other categories, the insurance advertisers. And ended up selling, you could only have one of those insurance ads in the Sunday paper. And I think I ended up selling out the newspaper for about 3 months out. And now there was it would be a lot more direct mail and of course television, much more for insurance advertisers. But while there, a friend of mine from the newsroom called me one day. He said, I've started a company called Dunhill Employment Agency. So I went over for his grand opening and met his wife. And the reason he had left the newspaper, he had done a expose of the sheriff down in Newport, Kentucky. And he was a writer for the afternoon paper. He'd put together about a 3-part program about how there was so much corruption. And one night, there was a knock on the door about 3 o'clock in the morning, and 2 guys were there he had never seen before, beat him up and put him in the hospital. And I think he said he spit up blood for 2 or 3 days. it was then that he decided the personnel business might be a little bit easier. So Dunhill personnel was starting, and after a few weeks, he called me and he said, let's go to lunch. And he had someone with Johnson and Johnson with him. So I didn't know that this person was there, but I thought just the two of us were having lunch. Well, there were three of us, and we went to lunch and had a good lunch. And on the spot, they made me an offer, but they wanted to meet my wife also. And
why is that?
well, I found out later, they said if I could sell myself to an attractive, intelligent woman, they felt like I could be a good salesperson selling to nurses and doctors. So I was, I ended up taking the position and moving to St. Louis, Missouri, and enjoyed living there for several years, and had half of the states of Illinois, southern half, and about a third of Iowa and half the eastern half of Missouri as my territory. And after a couple of years, that position expanded and I became a district manager with 5 salesmen working for me. And it was a very good experience. And one of my distributors ended up offering me a position I couldn't refuse back in Indiana. But without looking at a map, it was Fort Wayne, Indiana. And I didn't realize Fort Wayne, Indiana was just about as far away from New Albany, Indiana, as St. Louis was. So we moved to Fort Wayne, and I worked there for several years, selling hospital supplies and medical supplies to hospitals and nursing homes and some doctors' offices. And the person that owned the company lived in the John Hancock building on, I think it was about the 70th floor. And he was telling me when he came to Fort Wayne one time, he came over because he was also an interior decorator. So we did the interior decorating for a nursing home there in Fort Wayne. So I picked him up at the airport, and he told me that he never ate in his apartment. He was a bachelor. He said there's several restaurants in the John Hancock building, and he always ate there. Or he ordered food to come up to him, but he had nothing in his refrigerator, nothing for snacks, and I was kind of amazed at that. He said a lot of people that move into the John Hancock building cannot handle it because most of the apartments are glass wall on the outside wall, and to be in the clouds is too much for many of them. So they have to break their lease after sometimes just days. But I enjoyed working with him and for that company. And then a headhunter contacted me there in Fort Wayne, and he said, "How would you like to work in international trade?" And I said, "Well, I've never worked in international trade, but I'm happy doing with the clients I have." And I was traveling into Michigan, southern Michigan, and the top northern half of Indiana. And he said, "Daryl," he said, "this is really a good opportunity." He said, "I applied for the job myself, and they wouldn't accept me." He said, they had a fellow hired from IBM that they were ready to hire, and he went back and told them what they were going to offer him at IBM, and they said, "We'll match that, and don't go to work for them, stay with us." So he called this international trade company and said, "I'm going to stay with IBM after all," after he had accepted the job. What I learned later was about 2 or 3 weeks later, he called And he said, they're not doing what they said they would do. Can I come to work for you in international trade? But anyway, I went out and I took a series of tests, including psychological tests, and met with their psychologist. And they offered me the position, and I became an import manager and imported products from overseas, some that they'd already been working with, and some I developed a market for. And one of the products was tapioca starch. Almost nobody knows where tapioca comes from, but it actually comes, because I've been to some of the farms, it comes from the root of a shrub. And it's used in puddings and it's used in meat processing because you can cook the meat and it works as a binder, sort of like if someone's making a meatloaf, they might use cracker crumbs or cereal of some sort. So I imported that and imported gloves from Spain and from Hong Kong, and later was given the responsibility of some export lines, one of them being a company called Chore Boy. They make farm dairy equipment out of here in Indiana. And I would travel overseas for them and also check prices on some of the products I was selling, such as finding, when I was in Guatemala one time, I was taken to a farm that a distillery, or brewery, I guess you'd say, this brewery owned this tapioca field. And I was in Guatemala in a motel that had a fence around it, and you had to get permission to get in or out or have somebody unlock it for you because there was so much danger of things being stolen. Well, I knew they were going to meet me and take me to the farm, but I assumed that it would be in an automobile. But when they came to pick me up, they took me over to the airport, and I just envisioned that this was some plane that was 20 years old and dilapidated, but they picked me up in a brand new Jeep that maybe had 6 months, still smelled new, and took me to the farm by a plane that couldn't have been a year old that seated 6 people. So it was, I think, 3 of them and me, and we went out and we saw the tapioca fields, and they told me about some of their other products, and had lunch there, and then they flew me back to Guatemala. Which reminds me of another story of one time I was in South Bend and had to return home to Indianapolis, and the flight was a Delta flight. It was one of their flights that really takes a smaller airplane. So one of their commuter planes. It was scheduled to go from Midway Airport or O'Hare to South Bend and then go over to Fort Wayne and then back down to Indianapolis, where I was living at the time. And the plane came and emptied, and the pilot and the co-pilot came in. So after about 20 or 30 minutes, I heard this Mr. Nash, so they called me, and I went over to see what it was about, and it was the pilot. He said, you'll be the only person on the plane. It's a 31-seat plane, and for balance, as ballast, we'd like for you to sit in the very end of the plane and sit in the middle row. So as I sat in this nearly new plane that seated 31 people, and it was the co-pilot and me, and I'm thinking, if my graduating class could see me now, So as we're approaching the Indianapolis airport, I heard this co-pilot say, the temperature at Indianapolis airport is 72 degrees. 72 degrees. The wind is out of the northwest, and we hope you have a good day, sir. So that was kind of exciting. I was sorry that the pictures weren't there, for the camera crew wasn't there to take my pictures, but that didn't happen. So that's a bit of my career, but enjoyed the international trade immensely, and going into other countries was just an education in every culture. And primarily I was in Central and South America. Interestingly, one time I was in Venezuela and Colombia, and that was as far south as I was going on that trip. And I got a call from one of the factories that was building products in Indiana that we shipped all over the world, and shipped and sold and shipped. And I got a call from this president of this company, and he said, Daryl, we just got a lead. Somebody's interested in our products in Santiago, Chile. And I had to remind him that when I was in Venezuela, I was not halfway to Santiago, Chile. Chile's a very long country, and there's some countries between Venezuela and Colombia and Chile. But I don't think we've ever been accused of being, in our country, our schools haven't ever taught us as much geography as a lot of people know. Perhaps language and geography has suffered by the fact that we're a world power, and we feel like we don't have to learn other languages because of our strength and our size. But in travels, I got to see a bullfight, both in Venezuela and a bullfight in Mexico. But I rooted for the wrong team. I always felt sorry for the bull. And that's a losing cause. That's almost like being a Chicago Cub fan. When you start the year, almost every year you know you aren't going anyplace. But in addition to seeing the bullfights, it was just so amazing to see all the pomp and the circumstance, and see all the excitement that goes into it. It was such a big event in Madrid and in Caracas. Also got to see most of the highlights of London, and enjoyed that immensely as well, and saw the Royal Castle, and it just added so much to life to be able to experience other countries and other cultures. And I always thought that someday, as the world gets smaller, it's going to be pretty commonplace for my children and grandchildren to be traveling to other countries. When I was in the 8th grade, I went on a railroad trip. My school had scheduled, very clever of them, a railroad trip to Washington, D.C. during a teachers' convention. And as an 8th grader, we spent 3 days seeing just about everything in Washington, D.C. that you can see, included the hotel and all these different sites, and enjoyed that immensely. And I remember the price was $55, and you had to put $20 down, and had no idea that my children and my grandchildren would be in Washington, D.C., but flying after that, and that my grandchildren would be in different countries. So I've always felt that as the world got smaller, we would be doing a lot more traveling, or the world seemed smaller. But I had no idea, of course, of the internet, which puts us in touch and with other people so easily. And also our cell phones, we can so easily dial and keep them in our pocket and talk to anybody, any place in the world almost.
So, how much do you think luck played a role in your career?
I think that luck probably plays a little bit in everybody's career. A little bit. Sometimes it's the timing. While I was in international trade, I ended up leaving that company and going to start my own company. And the product that we first sourced and found and started buying in trailer loads was rubber gloves from Spain. The company, then we added some other safety supplies, but I sold to the American Hospital Supply. I was the co-founder and the president of the company, and I was a salesman also. A small company, you do everything, including carry the garbage out and everything. I sold them the product to American Hospital Supply, which at the time was the biggest hospital supply company in the country. They were bought out by a company by the name of Baxter, and Baxter was like David buying out Goliath. It's amazing how when you have the money, you can do a lot of things. And I know we found that here in Indianapolis with a couple of insurance companies that one of them, which was smaller than Bankers Life, ended up buying Bankers Life and getting the name and the prestige and the respect and the size. So I enjoyed selling these products and again being in touch with people all over the world and sourcing out new products to sell and to import into the United States. Oh, I'm sorry. You asked about luck. Luck is a factor. When I had the rubber glove business, I sold it about a year before the AIDS epidemic came, which, in reading about epidemics, pandemics, for the last 1,000 years, the bubonic plague stands out. But I was surprised to see that with the AIDS epidemic, we had, or pandemic, there were 30 million people that died of AIDS. And I remember how scary it was because as a child, I remember the scary word was polio. And I had, at this little country school that I had attended, I had a friend who had 2 arm braces around his crutches because he'd had polio and had spent quite a lot of time in what was called an iron lung, which was shaped about like a coffin, and without that iron lung, their lungs couldn't really breathe, and they wouldn't have made it. But he progressed and got out of that. But the AIDS virus was somewhat similar in that I remember a nurse that was told me that one person had become psychotic while with AIDS and the scare of it, and his friends, and some of his friends had died. And she said his desire was to try to spit in a nurse or a doctor's eyes and pass it on to them. So they had to wear headgear to protect their head and their face. So I sold the glove business about a year before the AIDS epidemic, and I remember having a USA Today and reading it and seeing in the classified ads people selling cases of gloves for ridiculous prices. So I guess there is a bit of luck, but most of the time I believe we make our own luck. And I always like something that I learned from a military fellow. It's the 7 P's. Proper prior planning prevents poor performance. And it's a guideline that I've often looked at and thought through. And it reminded me of something that my dad used to say that used to get on my nerves as I was growing up. If I had a problem, he'd say, "What did you learn from it?" And that's probably something we should all ask ourselves on a regular basis. When something doesn't go right, what did you learn from it? I've used that with my daughters a few times, but not excessively, because it's not something that's welcome to a question to be asked. But luck does play a part in it. But what I found is that by hard work, you can get more accomplished and will get more accomplished with your hard work and enthusiasm than the person that has a lot more intelligence or maybe a lot more skill. But hard work, patience, perseverance, enthusiasm, all these are very important words.
When you see people struggling economically, how much do you think of that as effect of lack of hard work, and how much do you think of it as environmental?
If I put a percentage on it, I've always been proud and pleased and blessed by the family that I grew up in. They were a working class family, but they did a lot of studying, and one of my brothers graduated from IU when he was 35 years old because he realized the trade that he was in the newspaper business was going to be done away with. So he ended up graduating from Wichita State. If I had to put a percentage on the luck versus hard work and diligence, I would put luck maybe at 10% for most of us. But there are times where a person is born into a family and somebody gives them $400 million and says, "Okay, now go do something with that." That's kind of rare, but I've known a few people that have inherited 100 million plus. And I guess you could call it luck, but the family you're born into has an awful lot to do with your success. Your environment and your family are very, very big factors.
What led you to retire from before you worked as a caretaker, from your last job before that?
Mm-hmm. Because of the background and education in sales and marketing, with both IU and the Clyde Bedell School of Advertising and Marketing. I was, let me ask you to repeat that question again so I can deal with it exactly.
Perhaps I didn't phrase it exactly how I went.
What led me to retire?
Yeah.
Okay, because of the background I had, you can take I'll pat myself a bit on the back. You can take a good salesperson, and there's a need in almost every company, whether it's a mortuary or whether it's a automobile sales. A sales and marketing person can be very advantageous if they're really of quality. I had worked in my last career before retiring as a mortgage counselor, and I had been with the company less than a year, and this was a company that had 36 offices around the country as a mortgage lender, and won a national contest over 800 other mortgage brokers around the country. And in fact, I still have one of the flat screen televisions that I won by winning this contest. What I found was that even though some of these people had been in the business for years, some of them had burned out. Some of them liked to take a good long smoke break. Some of them came in kind of late. What I found was this was a good opportunity to outwork these other 800 mortgage brokers from around the country. What I didn't foresee was the housing market was going to fall apart, which it did, and my company, even with their many offices, folded and went out of business. So at the ripe old age of about 62, I found myself unemployed, and at 62, very difficult to get another position. So I took really early retirement, and it was not till I was into my 70s that I decided that instead of just trying to read all the books in the local library, it would make a lot of sense for me to do something for others. I've been so blessed in my life with both my family, my childhood family, as well as my offspring. I've been tremendously blessed. We've had great health, and I decided that I need to do something for someone else. It's great to have knowledge and to read and enjoy reading, and I never quit doing that, but it's also important to help others. As my faith would tell me, that I'm a little selfish if I'm not doing something for someone else. So I've tried to do that throughout my life, and in my 70s, I went to work as a caregiver, working with people who had lived most of their life and sometimes were in hospice and down to their last few months, and some that were going to live longer than that. Some were Alzheimer's, some were other dementia patients, some were veterans, and I could provide some both physical and sometimes emotional support. Not that I ever tried to be a psychiatrist or psychologist, but I remember one client that I had to talk him out of wanting to commit suicide 3 or 4 times. And one day I called the office and I said, this was the first time it had happened, I said, he's determined to commit suicide tonight. This is really a challenge for me. And they said, it would be for us too. We've got the right person with him, so do what you can. And the next day when I went to his house to take him to lunch and spend a few hours with him around the lunchtime, he was just as happy as he could be, and things had turned around completely. But working with people that are having handicaps of different sorts, mental, physical, and many times many physical ailments, helps you really to appreciate what you have. Even if you yourself have some limited abilities in some areas of your life, or whether it's walking, or whether it's vision, or whether it's hearing, when you see someone that's in the last days, the last years of their life, and maybe they've gone through years of challenges, you really have to realize and stop and think how blessed you really have been. That you've had friends. And what often happens is in older people, many of their friends pass away, or their friends go through some of the same problems they're going through. I remember visiting with a 94-year-old aunt many years ago, and I said, "Aunt Viola, what's the hardest thing about being 94 years old? You seem to be very happy." And she said, "Daryl, I'll tell you, there's nobody around that I can enjoy and talk to about the good old days. All my friends and my 3 sisters, one of whom was my mother, all my friends and my farmer husbands, and have all passed away." And she said, "I'm living with my daughter and son-in-law, but they have the challenges of their own children, and I'm living with other people, but I'm very lonely." And it's kind of struck a chord that just because you're around a lot of people or other people does not necessarily mean that you can feel like you're really fitting in. And sometimes as we age, I've seen many people feel like they're very unproductive and, I'll use the word, useless. And that is so sad that anyone ever feels that way.
Do you ever feel that way?
Rarely. I'm really blessed with a terrific family that checks on me. In fact, sometimes worries about me too much.
How do you cope with the death of your peers?
Death of my parents was very difficult. I guess I have to go back a little bit. When I was 15, my grandmother, who had lived with us up until the last couple of years of her life, she passed away at about 1954, 55. And the only nursing homes there were at that time were, in most cases, I guess in almost every case, was somebody would buy a big mansion that maybe had 5 bedrooms or 6 bedrooms and make each one of those bedrooms another bedroom for 1 or 2 beds. Well, my grandmother passed away, and she was 93 years old, and I didn't realize until years later what year she really was born. And I remember sitting on her lap as a youngster listening to the radio, and the radio was maybe 4 feet tall and 4 feet wide, and you could pick up stations over in Europe. I remember somebody talking about they had heard Hitler making a speech. So that was one of my first brushes with death, when she passed away. But she had been born when Abraham Lincoln was president. And it took me years later for that to sink in, as I had sat on her lap, and she was born when Abraham Lincoln was president. When she passed away, my father came home from the nursing home as I was finishing my paper route. He believed in hard work at an early age. So we sat down and he said, "Son, do you realize the changes that have been made in your grandmother's lifetime?" He said, "I can remember when they were putting telephone service into some parts of Kentucky, and people were laughing because they saw the wire, and they said, 'There isn't any hole in there.' You can't yell if there's no hole." So the changes that took place in her lifetime, I guess there were trains back then. But then when you look at the changes that took place in the 1800s and the wars in Philippines and Hawaii, and then you see the technology that came about, the radios and the televisions and the planes and the jet planes and just on and on. And of course we've seen it incredibly changes that have been made in the last 10 or 20 years even. The thought of being able to have a telephone in your pocket and walk outside or go for a ride and have access to a telephone would have been just a dream not very many years ago. I remember as a child reading the cartoons of Dick Tracy in the funny papers in the comic section, and Dick Tracy had a phone that on his wrist that he could talk into, and now my daughter has one, and she was in the grocery store with me recently, and she's talking on the phone, and I thought she's talking to me. I said, "Talk a little louder, I can't hear you, you got your back to me." She said, no, I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to my phone. So when I experienced my grandmother passing away at 15, that was probably the second or third death that I had experienced. My mother's mother passed away when I was maybe 9 or 10. And a lady across the street had passed away when I was about 4 years old. I don't recall whether my parents took me to the funeral home or not, but I do remember a short while after she had died, I knew that she had died. She lived across the street, and I used to go over there and enjoyed going over there because nobody that I knew kept soft drinks in their home. But she did because her husband was an alcoholic, and he had a lot of different drinks that he mixed with different soft drinks. So I would go over there, and sometimes he would have a party, and he and his sons would get together, and there wouldn't be any soft drinks. So I'd have to go home disappointed. Well, when Mrs. Kelly was her name, when Mrs. Kelly passed away, I knew that she had died and she wasn't around anymore. And I had a little sickness a week or two later, and my mother said, "You have diarrhea." And I said, "Does this mean I'm going to die?" It seemed to make sense to me. And she said, no, it's not that bad. But my father passed away, and I got the telephone call from my oldest brother that he was in Florida, and he had taken my mother to see a doctor. And in the wintertime, it's hard to get into a doctor because the population explodes during the winter months, goes way down to nearly normal in the summer. So my brother called and said that he had passed away while in Fort Myers, Florida. Well, the doctor had refused to sign the death certificate because my mother was taken. Dad took Mom to the doctor, and Dad went in with her, and he said, "Doctor, I'm sicker than she is." And the doctor said, "Well, just go home and take a nap," and then turned to my mother and ignored my dad the rest of that visit. And Dad had a heart attack and died that night. The doctor would not sign a death certificate until he was forced to by a lawyer in southern Indiana who forced him to sign a death certificate so that we could get my father to body to come home. My mother passed away maybe 20 years later, and she had been pretty healthy, but sometimes she wouldn't take her heart medicine because she felt good, which is a reminder to me to always take medicine the doctor advises you take. And my mother had a stroke at 85 and was paralyzed, and you could tell by her eyes that she kind of understood the conversation pretty well, but she didn't have any movement, and spent the last 3 years of her life in a nursing home. And my siblings and I would take turns going to the nursing home every night and feeding her dinner, because her weight had dropped from about 140 pounds down to about 110, because she was a very private lady, and she didn't like the thought that through her inability to hold the fork or the spoon, she was dropping food on herself, so she wouldn't eat in front of others. So we took turns to be sure that she had a good dinner every night. So when she passed away, it was with the 4 siblings around her bed, and it was a difficult time, but it was once again another opportunity to experience death. But being a person of faith, I felt certain that she was going to heaven, because she was one of the most religious and unselfish people I've ever known. She would fry chicken many times on Sunday, and she would let everybody else take a piece of chicken, and she would save the neck for herself. And would talk about, I said, "Mother, eat a piece of chicken, it's got some meat on it." And her comment was, "Oh, that's such a sweet piece, I like that piece." But you knew that she wanted all of the rest of us to have the meaty parts. But that probably, with both parents passing away, a neighbor passing away, my grandmother who had lived with us until I was about 12 or 13, living with us, passing away, it probably prepared me for spending time with my wife, who was seriously handicapped at the last of her life and passed away.